Okay, good morning everyone. My name's Barbara Allan. I'm speaking from a very blustery Hull, and I'm pleased to be invited to talk to you today about e-learning. My involvement with e-learning I've been involved in it for about the past 5-10 years, both as a student, as a lecturer, and I've also been involved in developing e-learning programs in quite a number of library and information units. What I'm going to do is really talk through my PowerPoint with reference to my own experience and ideas. So if we move on to the second slide, I thought a useful starting point would be to think about underlying approaches to teaching and learning. And I've separated these out into two main approaches. The first one is behaviorist, and this is where we transmit information and ideas in a pre-designed program and really want students or other people to learn a particular set of ideas or skills. And this is in contrast with a constructivist approach, which is where learners and tutors work together as colleagues in groups, in learning communities. And really, in a constructivist approach, this is where individuals construct knowledge. So, for example, I was involved in an e-learning program at Birmingham University where we had groups of library staff, IT staff and lecturers, and they worked together in groups and designed their own programs, taking into account their own particular situation. So if we move on to slide 3, I always like to hold this in my mind when I'm thinking about planning and designing e-learning programs or any kind of learning or training programs. You'll see on the slide at the top, we've got, if people are listening only, they only retain about 5% of what's said. If we've got audiovisual slides, as we have in this case this morning, it goes up to 20%, demonstration 30%, but once we get people talking to each other, the retention rate gets to about 50%. So for me, if I'm developing any kind of program, I really want people to be talking or practicing or actually applying their learning to a particular situation immediately or helping others to learn. So I just think this is a useful background slide and set of ideas for design and development of e-learning programs. If we move on now to slide 4, the 3 main approaches to e-learning. The first is 100% e-learning, and this is where all the contact with people is via ICT. So it's all over the internet, whether it's by email, discussion groups or whatever, and you have no face-to-face contact with people. The next approach is where you have face-to-face provision, and this is supported by e-learning. So, for example, with my students in Hull in developing their information skills, we have face-to-face lectures, seminars, but then we have our own e-learning system, and we get students to follow e-learning activities to help boost the face-to-face. The last approach is what's called blended learning, and this is where you have an integrated mix of e-learning and face-to-face. And increasingly, research seems to suggest that a blended approach is the most appropriate one. We'll move on now to the next slide, where I've identified 2 main approaches to e-learning. The first of these is using interactive learning packages, and there's lots of generic pre-prepared packages available, and I'm sure you're all using these in your workplace. Sometimes people develop their own packages, and I'll look at this a little bit later. But with interactive learning packages, really you either get an off-the-shelf package or develop your own, which can be quite expensive and time-consuming. The next approach is using supported online learning, and this is the bit that I find really interesting. This is where you can get online groups or communities working together in a virtual environment. Another approach is through coaching and mentoring. So, for example, I'm involved in a mentoring project at the moment. I'm mentoring a person who works in a local authority about 100 miles from where I'm sitting now, and all the mentoring activities take place through a virtual environment, though we do meet up for coffee every so often. So two different approaches, the learning a package approach or the supported approach, which is where the learners are working with some kind of tutor, facilitator, coach. Moving on to slide 6, I've just put up there an example of one of the interactive learning packages that I've used and I get our students to use. I'm sure some of you have used it. It's a Tonic Net Skills interactive package. Moving on to the next one, this is one I found from America. It's a library skills induction package for new library employees, and I just put it there because I thought it was quite a nice one. It's nice, very user-friendly, and I thought it was an interesting application of e-learning. Moving on then, we'll look at some of the advantages of interactive packages. Certainly they allow you to learn at your own pace and time. They can look exciting, look modern. I know our students like them for that reason. They often use very clear language. The content's presented in small chunks. You can work your own way through the interactive learning packages, so you can miss bits out, or you can start in the middle and then go to the end and all sorts of things. You can have images, diagrams, sound, video clips, all sorts of things. You can have lots of activities. You can test people. You can have feedback written into the package, and they're accessible. You can access them from home, work, wherever. So they're just some of the advantages of interactive learning packages. And when they work, I think they're really, really good. However, there are some disadvantages. From the learner's point of view, they need time to learn how to get to grips with a package. Some people find them quite isolating and much prefer to learn in groups with other people. Some packages don't take into account individual learning preferences. So some people, for example, really love activities, other people don't. Some people are reluctant to use technology, and a really obvious disadvantage is that you have to have technology available to be able to access them. And some of the packages require really top state-of-the-art computers, which not everybody has. I know my computer isn't state-of-the-art, and there's some things on interactive learning packages that take so long to download and run that I've sort of lost patience with them and moved on to something else. So there's some of the disadvantages from the learner. I think there's some disadvantages from the library information worker's perspective as well. I certainly found that pre-prepared packages are not always 100% appropriate for the learner. Sometimes the language isn't quite right. So, for example, packages that I use with students that use the word student, members of staff don't like to use those packages just because they use the word student. And pre-prepared packages, sometimes the style of language just doesn't fit into our own particular work environment. If we have to develop our own packages, then it's quite expensive in terms of time and cost. The skills required for development, I've certainly found that though I can write the materials, I need some sort of graphic designer input to make the packages look good. And that means I need a graphics person beside me. Often they overuse technical effects, which can mean that some people can't access them. So there are disadvantages in the interactive packages. What I'm going to talk about next is the use of online communication tools. And on slide 11, you'll see a whole list of online communication tools, including teleconferencing that we're using today. And we can use all these different methods to communicate with our learners. Moving on to the next slide, I just put up a picture for our Blackboard site at the university where for a particular course we can set up things like group work discussion boards, etc. So I'll move quickly on to the next slide. With supported online learning, you can get people to work in groups. They can work on projects, produce reports, produce websites. I had one group of library staff who worked in online groups producing handouts and learning activities for their learners. You can work with a facilitator, or groups can manage themselves. So there's lots of different things you can do in an online environment. Some of the issues for learners I've put up there, access to IT and IT support. They've got to feel motivated and confident. The need to be able to fit it into their work-home life. I've certainly come across people who find it quite challenging to access the computer or the phone line at home because of teenagers in the house who want to use it. And finally, people need to manage their own time and any information overload. If you're receiving 20, 30, 40 messages a day, it can be quite a challenge to manage those when you're working. Moving on to the next slide. Some more issues for students and learners is that if you're working in an online environment with other learners, sometimes people find they initially feel isolated. They might send a message and there's no reply for a day, and it can cause some people a bit of distress. It takes time to find a virtual voice, to find the style and tone you feel comfortable with. You need to be able to write messages to individuals, but be aware that the whole group's reading them. For some people, issues of speller and grammar cause problems, and the use of humour in online groups can be a bit dodgy. So we'll move on now to 16, issues for tutors in online activities. A lot of research suggests that in an online environment, tutors need to move from what they call being a sage on the stage to being a guide from the side. So in other words, you're facilitating and guiding learners rather than leading them directly. You need to plan and manage group activities, and there's a different feel to that in an online environment than there is face-to-face, and that takes a bit of a while to adapt to. And you need to manage your time and make time to work as an online tutor. Moving on to slide 17, program design stage normally involves these sort of phases. So if you're working online with groups, there'll be normally some kind of induction, a socialization period. You need to give people time to learn as an e-learner, and that quite often involves time reflecting on time and reflecting on the process. And some people really reckon that it's worthwhile having a virtual social space, like an online cafe, where people can go to. I put a question mark there because I know some people don't like that idea and say it can be quite divisive. Moving on again to slide 18, what I've put up here is the 5-stage model of e-learning that was developed by Gilly Salmon. And if you're interested in running online activities with learners, then I really advise you to look at the work of Gilly Salmon. She writes very clearly and has some really useful ideas. And this 5-stage model just suggests that for new e-learners, they first of all go through a stage of access and motivation, then online socialization, then information exchange, where they're exchanging ideas, perhaps exchanging references. Then they move into knowledge construction. And finally, they move into what she calls development, which is really when you're taking off as an e-learner and want to lead and facilitate the processes yourself. So that 5-stage model I think is really useful. And if you do anything after this talk, I'd suggest you look that up and read up about it. I'll move on now to support issues. As with any technical situation, including the one we're involved in now, you need technical help, and that needs to be planned in advance. Online tutors need support too, either from colleagues or a mentor. And last but not least, my experience is that online learners really like a set of documentation. They like printouts or a CD that they can hold in the hand so they feel they've got something tangible to read if things get a bit tricky. So supporting e-learners is really, really important. And I know my experience this morning when I phoned in was it was really reassuring to have a friendly voice to guide me through the process. So it's the same in any e-learning situations. So finally, a few references. I wrote a book a few years ago in e-learning and teaching in library and information services, and this year myself and a colleague Dina have produced a book on facilitating virtual learning communities. I've put Julie Salmon's reference up there as well because I think that's really, really useful. Finally, thank you very much for listening to me. I now look forward to any questions.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Barbara. That was a very fascinating overview of e-learning there.